The house sits on an ordinary street in old Bukhara, walls the color of dust, a courtyard door that looks like every other courtyard door on the block. Nothing about the outside tells you what happened inside. That was the point. The emir of Bukhara had forbidden his Jewish subjects from building new synagogues, so families built this instead, a private home that just happened to function as a house of worship, generation after generation, hidden in plain sight behind mud brick and an unremarkable gate. The Rubinov House Synagogue still stands today, and for a century and a half it kept its secret the way a family keeps a secret, quietly, deliberately, behind a door nobody thought to knock on twice. But here's what nobody praying inside those walls could have known. 150 years later, geneticists would go looking for a different kind of secret, one written not in stone or scripture, but in blood. And they'd find that this community, which had spent centuries hiding its religion from the outside world, had also been carrying a hidden split inside itself, one that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with where, exactly, in Central Asia, its ancestors had settled. This is a population that once numbered close to 45,000 across Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the surrounding region. Today it's scattered: Queens, Tel Aviv, Melbourne, with barely 100 people left in Bukhara itself, the city that gave the whole community its name. Two questions drive everything that follows. Where did these people actually come from? And what does their DNA say about whether they were ever really one people to begin with? So what was actually hiding inside those walls? A religion, or a much older secret? Because buried in a modern genetic catalog is a finding that reframes the entire community. A single eye disorder, traced specifically to Bukharan Jews with roots in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, and a second, unrelated mutation, traced specifically to those with roots in Uzbekistan. Same name, same faith. Two separate genetic stories running underneath it the whole time. If you're into the stuff textbooks don't put in the footnotes, hit subscribe. This channel lives in those footnotes. The story the community tells about itself starts long before any of that. It starts with an exile that may not have happened the way anyone was taught. Bukharan Jewish families have long told a version of their own history that begins with catastrophe. Descent from the 10 lost tribes, driven from their homeland when Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. It's a clean, ancient story, and it's the one passed down at family tables. Most historians tell a different story. The more widely accepted dating points not to Assyria but to Babylon, the exile of 586 BCE, following the fall of the First Temple in Jerusalem. Some historians go further, dating actual Jewish arrival in Central Asia to the 6th century BCE, journeying east out of Iran along routes that would later become part of the Silk Road. Then there's a third version, and it's the one that unsettles the first two. A harder look at the archaeological and textual record turns up no evidence, none, placing Jews in Samarkand or Bukhara before the 11th century CE. Not a fragment, not an inscription, nothing. If that's accurate, both the Assyrian and the Babylonian origin stories are off by well over 1,000 years. What the evidence does support is a far less romantic timeline. Waves of Jewish families migrating into Central Asia between the 10th and 16th centuries CE, arriving from Iran and Iraq, most likely as Silk Road merchants and traders looking for opportunity, not as refugees fleeing ancient catastrophe. There's a clue sitting in the city's own name that supports the later timeline. Bukhara doesn't come from Hebrew or Persian or any language tied to an ancient Israelite exile. It comes from the Sanskrit word vihara, meaning Buddhist monastery. The region had already been layered with Zoroastrian, Buddhist, and other religious traditions long before any Jewish community took root there, which makes a claim of continuous Jewish presence going back to 722 BCE difficult to square with the linguistic record. The uncomfortable twist is this: the "we've been here for thousands of years" narrative that Bukharan Jewish families have told about themselves for generations is the very narrative that the historians who study this community most closely are the ones contesting. Move the clock forward 800 years, and the record gets sharper. By the time modern genetics enters the picture, the question isn't just when this community arrived, it's where they fit among Jewish populations worldwide. And the first real answer to that comes from a genome-wide study that mapped Jewish ancestry on a global scale. In 2010, Behar and colleagues published a landmark study in Nature that analyzed genome-wide data across Jewish populations worldwide and sorted them into three major clusters. One grouped Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and North African Jews together. Another sat between the Caucasus and Iran, A third centered on Yemenite Jews. Across nearly all of these groups, something consistent emerged. Jewish samples formed a remarkably tight subcluster, one that overlapped genetically with Druze and Cypriot populations, not with the European, Middle Eastern, or North African populations these communities had lived alongside for centuries. Two groups broke that pattern entirely. Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, clustered genetically with their non-Jewish Ethiopian neighbors instead of with other Jewish populations. Indian Jews, the Bene Israel and the Kokini, did the same, clustering with local Indian populations rather than with the broader Jewish genetic signature. That split matters because it establishes two competing outcomes for what centuries of diaspora life can do to a community's genetic identity. Genome-wide data traces the origins of most Jewish diaspora communities broadly back to the Levant, no matter how many centuries or how many thousands of miles separated them from it. But that preservation isn't automatic. Some communities kept the signature. Others were absorbed, which raises the exact question this episode is built around. After roughly 1,000 years embedded in Central Asia, which pattern do Bukharan Jews actually show? Preserved distinction, like most of the global Jewish population, or absorption, like the Beta Israel and the Bene Israel. The blood type data from Israeli hospitals in the 1980s got there first. Long before genome-wide sequencing existed as a tool, researchers were already probing this question with cruder methods. And one study, run in Israel in 1984, gives the first hard numbers. Researchers sampled 113 Bukharan Jews and 134 Georgian Jews, all living in Israel, testing blood groups, isoenzymes, HLA antigens, and immunoglobulin allotypes across both populations. The goal was to measure genetic distance and internal population structure using the tools available at the time. Inbreeding estimates came back low for both groups, but not identically low. Bukharan Jews showed an inbreeding coefficient of 0.0088. Georgian Jews came in at 0.0011, roughly 8 times lower. G6PD deficiency, a common marker in population genetics research, measured at just 2.2% among Bukharan Jews, compared to 6.0% among Georgian Jews. The Bukharan sample carried its own distinctive fingerprint of high-frequency markers. The B blood group at 0.243, the JKA antigen at a striking 0.705, HLA-A29 at 0.167, HLA-A30 at 0.116, and HLA-B7 at 0.124. Then comes the finding that doesn't fit the expected geography. Two markers associated with African ancestry, the Duffy antigen Phi at 0.146 and the CD haplotype at 0.122, turned up in the Bukharan Jewish sample at real, measurable frequency. In the Georgian Jewish sample, tested in the same study using the same methods, both markers were completely absent. Georgian Jews live closer, geographically, to populations where African-associated lineage markers are well documented. Bukharan Jews, sitting further east and further from those populations, are the ones who carried the signal instead. When researchers calculated genetic distance across 5 Jewish populations, Bukharan, Georgian, Iranian, Cochin, and Libyan, Georgian and Iranian Jews came out closest to each other of any pair tested. Cochin Jews sat furthest from all the others. Blood groups are blunt instruments. Mitochondrial DNA is a scalpel. And when researchers finally turned that scalpel on Bukharan Jews specifically, they found something that had never turned up anywhere else on the planet. Researchers working with the Mizrahi Jewish DNA Project identified a maternal lineage they named T2C1G2, and to date, it has not been found in any population on Earth outside of Bukharian Jews. Both known carriers of this lineage trace their maternal ancestry specifically to Samarkand, one of the 2 cities most closely tied to the community's history. What sets T2C1G2 apart are 2 specific mutations, T13818C and T8772C, layered on top of the broader T2C1 mitochondrial lineage that it descends from. That parent lineage isn't unique to Bukharan Jews at all. Iraqi Jews, Syrian Jews, and Tunisian Jews all carry T2C1 as well. But they carry different branches of it entirely, meaning the split between these communities' maternal lines happened generations before any of them settled in the locations where we find them today. Put plainly, the genetic story this maternal lineage tells is that Bukharian Jews carry primarily Middle Eastern maternal origins, not local Central Asian ancestry absorbed along the way. Centuries embedded in Samarkand and the surrounding region did not erase that maternal signature or replace it with something local. That result lines up directly with the framework from Behar's 2010 study. Bukharan Jews pattern with the group that preserved a distinct genetic lineage across the diaspora, not with the Beta Israel or the Bene Israel, the communities whose genetic signal was absorbed into their host populations instead. The mother's line says Middle East. The father's line tells a stranger story. One Bukharian paternal line, tracing back to Samarkand, belongs to Y-DNA haplogroup JFT1000592, a descendant branch of J2M172, with a most recent common ancestor dated to roughly 1150 BCE. That single number opens up a much wider web than the name suggests. Other known carriers of that same haplogroup include men with paternal lines from Libya, from Greece, from Armenia, from Saudi Arabia, and a Palestinian line from Hebron. A shared male ancestor, more than 3,000 years back, sits underneath all of them. Two other Bukharian Jews, both with paternal roots in Bukhara city itself, carry a different haplogroup entirely, EBY 8500, with a most recent common ancestor dated to around 550 BCE, and a wide confidence range stretching from 1350 BCE to 250 CE. Their closest genetic matches are not other Bukharian families. One is a Jewish man with a paternal line from Gaziantep, Turkey, a city with deep historic ties to Sephardic settlement. The other is a man from Spain, most likely descended from a Sephardic convert to Catholicism, whose family's Jewish origin was folded into Catholic Spain generations ago. A third Bukharian line, this one from Sug province in Tajikistan, carries haplogroup JBI 101844. Its closest known matches are Lebanese Maronite Christian paternal lines and Galilean Orthodox Christian lines from the region around the Sea of Galilee. Put all three findings side by side, and the picture that emerges is stranger than any single result on its own. The genetic threads running through Bukharian Jewish men do not stop at the edges of the Jewish world. They run into Christian Lebanon. They run into Catholic Spain. Men separated today by religion, geography, and centuries of divergent history share paternal lines with common ancestors who lived in the ancient Levant, long before any of the labels, Jewish, Christian, Sephardic, Bukharian, existed to divide them. Different faiths, different countries. Same root. Timur didn't care about any of this when he marched east in 1370. Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, ruled from 1370 to 1405, and when he made Samarkand the capital of his empire, he needed something the city didn't have, skilled labor and a lot of it, so he took it. Thousands of carpet weavers, silk dyers, artisans, and merchants were forcibly relocated from cities he had conquered across his empire, marched east to build up his new capital whether they wanted to go or not. Among those forced deportees were Jews and Christians pulled specifically from Kurdistan and from northern Syria. Once resettled in Samarkand, these Jewish deportees didn't bring their own dialect with them and keep it. They adopted the Eastern Persian Jewish dialect already spoken by the Jewish and Muslim communities already living there, blending into a linguistic identity that hadn't existed for them a generation earlier. This is the detail historians keep coming back to. Not a voluntary migration of merchants looking for new markets, but a forced relocation under an emperor's command. That forced blending is what many historians now identify as the actual founding event behind the community that would eventually be called Bukharan Jews. Not an ancient exile, not a slow trickle of traders, but a single violent act of imperial resettlement. The renewed, better documented Jewish presence in Bukhara city itself follows roughly 2 centuries later, in the early 17th century, marked by something concrete enough to date precisely, the construction of the city's first synagogue in 1620. 2 centuries later, someone finally wrote the rules down. The name itself came from an office, not from the people who carried it. Bukharan Jews is a 19th century invention, a Russian administrative label applied from the outside. It was coined for a specific bureaucratic purpose, to distinguish Jews living under the Bukharan Emirate, by then a Tsarist protectorate, from Jews living in nearby cities under direct Russian imperial control. Before that label existed, there was no single unified name for this population at all. The emirate itself, with its capital at Bukhara, spanned territory covering parts of what is today southern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Those borders didn't become the separate republics we know now until Soviet administrators redrew the map in the 1920s and 1930s, carving one region into several new political identities. Inside that emirate, the community spoke Bukhari, a Judeo-Tajik dialect layered with Hebrew and Aramaic vocabulary and written using Hebrew script, a language that was, in itself, a record of exactly how many different influences had folded into this population over the centuries. What's genuinely unclear, even to historians who specialize in this community, is what religious practice actually looked like before the late 18th century, before Sephardic influence arrived and reshaped it. There's a real gap in the record here, and it's not one that the genetic data can fill either. DNA can trace ancestry. It can't reconstruct what prayers sounded like in a home 300 years ago. That gap started closing in the late 18th century, when a Sephardic Kabbalist named Yosef Maman arrived in Bukhara. Maman set about reconnecting a community that had developed in relative isolation with the wider currents of rabbinic Judaism, reintroducing practices and texts that had drifted or been lost. Reconnection to the wider Jewish world didn't mean protection from the emir. Legally, Jews under the emirate held the status of dhimmi, protected unbelievers, a designation that guaranteed a kind of tolerated survival without anything resembling equal standing. It was a marginal position, and everyone inside it knew it. And yet, despite that marginal legal status, Jews became economically indispensable to the region. They played an outsized role in Silk Road trade, in crafts, and especially in textile dyeing, an industry where Jewish artisans built a reputation that outlasted the political restrictions placed on them. Those restrictions were real and specific. The emir forbade the Jewish community from constructing any new synagogues at all. So congregations adapted the only way available to them, holding services inside private homes built to look, from the street, like ordinary residences. The Rubinov House Synagogue, the same disguised structure this whole story opened with, is one of the surviving examples of exactly that adaptation. By 1849, the community that had grown up under these constraints numbered roughly 2,500 families. Each town organized itself around an elected communal leader called a kalantar, and the community built and ran its own network of schools. The population kept growing through absorption as well as birth. After a mob in Meshed, Persia forcibly converted that city's entire Jewish population. Refugees fled east and resettled specifically in the Bukharan towns of Shahrisabz and Merv, bringing their own histories into a community that was already an accumulation of displaced people. Then, in 1868, a new empire arrived and split the community's loyalties in two. Tsarist Russia conquered Turkestan in 1868, but the Bukharan emir wasn't removed from power. He kept his throne under Russian protection for roughly another 50 years. A strange arrangement that left the Jewish community answering to two competing authorities at once. Russia, for its part, initially courted Bukharan Jewish loyalty deliberately. Imperial administrators saw this community as the one reliably friendly population among all the peoples they had just conquered, a trust built on years of existing trade relationships between Jewish merchants and Russian commercial interests. Under Russian administration, Jewish communal autonomy went largely unrestricted, and Bukharan Jews grew into a genuinely powerful trading class, linking Central Asian commerce to the wider Russian imperial economy. Meanwhile, under the emir's own shrinking authority, the opposite was happening. Blaming the Jewish community for his loss of full sovereignty to the Tsar, the emir continued to subjugate the Jewish population within whatever territory he still controlled directly, even as, just beyond his reach, that same population was thriving under Russian protection. The decades that followed, spanning the late 19th and early 20th centuries, are remembered inside the community today as something close to a golden age. Relative freedom, flourishing education, arts, and commerce. Bukhari language scholars spent this period documenting religious texts that might otherwise have been lost, and musicians developed shashmakam, a distinctive genre blending Jewish and Central Asian musical traditions that has survived, largely intact, into the present day. The Soviet Union had a very different plan for all of it. Under Soviet rule, the Bukharan Jewish community reached its historical peak, somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 people spread across Central Asia. That growth happened alongside, not despite, a steady campaign to dismantle everything that made the community distinct. Between 1936 and 1938, Soviet authorities jailed a number of Jewish community leaders, removing the people who had organized religious and cultural life for generations. By 1938 and 1939, Jewish newspapers across the region had been shut down entirely. In 1940, the state finished the job on the written word. Publication of Judeo-Tajik books ceased completely, and Judeo-Bukharan schools, the same Komlo network the community had built and run itself under the emirate, were closed for good. Historical accounts are direct about what the Soviet government was actually trying to accomplish. The explicit goal was to smother Jewish culture specifically within the Bukharan community and force assimilation into the broader Soviet identity, stripping away language, schooling, and communal leadership in a coordinated sequence. None of that state pressure eliminated violence at the local level. Blood libels, the old false accusations historically used to incite mobs against Jewish communities, surfaced in Charjui in 1926, and again in the village of Agalik near Samarkand in 1930. Official suppression from Moscow and grassroots anti-Semitism on the ground were operating on two separate tracks, both aimed at the same population, neither one canceling out the other. None of it compared to what World War II would take. Not a footnote in the community's history. A near decapitation of it. An estimated 10,000 Bukharan Jews were killed or went missing through wartime conscription. Set against a total wartime population of only 30,000 to 45,000, that works out to somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire community, gone in a single global conflict. That scale of loss rarely surfaces in general World War II casualty discussions, precisely because Bukharan Jews were a small population folded into much larger Soviet military statistics, their specific losses absorbed into national totals too broad to isolate them. This demographic wound landed just one generation before the community's next major transformation, mass emigration, and the pressure driving that emigration only intensified after 1948, when the creation of Israel triggered a fresh wave of anti-Semitism across the region, as Muslim populations staged protests throughout Central Asia in response. The first real crack in the Iron Curtain came in secret, in the 1920s. The first wave began in the 1920s and ran into the early 1930s. Roughly 4,000 Bukharan Jews emigrated to Israel, most of it done secretly, in direct defiance of Soviet anti-immigration regulations that made this kind of departure illegal. Decades passed before the next major wave. Even after the Soviet government formally discontinued diplomacy with Israel and outright forbade Aliyah, approximately 8,000 Bukharan Jews still managed to immigrate to Israel between 1972 and the first half of 1975. A further roughly 15,500 followed later in the 1970s, pushing through a system explicitly designed to stop them. By 1987, combined Soviet and Israeli community records placed the total Bukharan Jewish population at about 85,000 worldwide. Of that number, roughly 45,000 were still living inside the Usur. About 32,000 had resettled in Israel, and about 3,000 had scattered to the United States and elsewhere. Then the dam broke entirely. In 1989, Gorbachev lifted restrictions on Jewish emigration altogether, and the overwhelming majority of the remaining Uzbek Jewish population began leaving almost immediately. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, what had been a steady trickle became a near-total exodus from Central Asia, emptying out communities that had existed in the same cities for centuries. Today, Bukhara's Jewish quarter has almost nobody left to walk its alleys. The global Bukharan Jewish population today is estimated between 300,000 and 350,000 people, and almost none of it lives in Central Asia anymore. Israel holds the largest share by far, roughly 160,000, concentrated in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, or Yehuda, Lod, and Holon. The United States holds roughly 70,000, and about 50,000 of them are packed into a single place, Queens, New York, a concentration so dense that the neighborhood carries the informal nickname Queenistan. That makes Queens the second largest Bukharian Jewish community anywhere on earth, ranked only behind Israel itself. Smaller communities persist elsewhere, roughly 3,000 to 3,500 in Austria, 2,000 in Germany, 1,500 in Canada, 1,000 in Russia, and a smaller presence in Australia. And back where the whole story started, in Bukhara itself, the city that gave this entire population its name, only around 100 Jews remain. What's left of the old Jewish quarter has been repurposed rather than abandoned outright. Family homes have been converted into hotels and museums. Former synagogues, once places where entire communities gathered in secret or in defiance of local rulers, now function primarily as tourist attractions, kept standing by charitable foundations rather than congregations. Which brings the story back to the genetics. because leaving didn't erase what's written in the DNA. Every clinical geneticist working with this population today relies on a specific reference. The NSPI Gene Review's Founder Variant Catalog for Bukharan Jews, a document built specifically to guide genetic counselors screening patients from this community. The first entry in that catalog is Adam TSL4, a gene linked to early-onset bilateral ectopia lentis, a serious eye disorder involving dislocation of the eye's lens, usually appearing in both eyes and often requiring intervention from childhood. A single mutation, C. 2594GGA, accounts for essentially 100% of all pathogenic variants found in this gene among Bukharan Jews. That's not a common variant among several. That's the variant. The carrier frequency attached to this mutation is 1 in 48, startlingly high for a disorder tied to a single gene, high enough that it functions almost like a signature. What makes this entry genuinely striking is where, specifically, it shows up. This founder mutation is documented specifically in Bukharan Jews whose ancestry traces to Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, not the broader Bukharan Jewish population as a whole, but this particular regional branch of it. The finding was published by Reinstein and colleagues in 2016 in a study examining Bukharian origin patients diagnosed with the condition. 200 miles west, in Uzbekistan proper, a completely different mutation was doing the same job. The mutation in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan wasn't the whole catalog. 200 miles west, in Uzbekistan proper, researchers found a second entry entirely. This one involves the M3 gene, and it causes a severe form of methylinotetrahydrofolate reductase deficiency, a metabolic condition tied to how the body processes folate. The specific mutation, C. 474A.T, carries a carrier frequency of 1 in 39, a different number, in a different gene, sitting in a different founder variant profile entirely. And critically, this mutation is documented specifically in Bukharan Jews, tracing their origin to Uzbekistan, not to Kazakhstan or Tajikistan. The finding was published by Ben Shakar and colleagues in 2012, describing its discovery in Bukharian patients. Put these two entries side by side, and something the community's shared name has always obscured comes into focus. Bukharan Jews is a single ethnonym, a single cultural identity, a single religious community. But the disease mutation record says otherwise. It shows at least two distinguishable founder profiles, each one tracking a different regional sub-origin within Central Asia, that only later merged under one shared identity. The internal geography of this population, Uzbekistan on one side, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan on the other, left a genetic signature that has outlasted the political borders that originally created that divide. The other entries in that same catalog fill in the rest of the picture. The PAH gene adds a third data point. Two specific mutations, pGlu 178GL-LU and p.pro281-LU, together account for 79% of all phenylketonuria-causing alleles identified in Bukharan Jews, a metabolic disorder that, left untreated, requires lifelong dietary management to prevent serious harm. TEC-PR2 pushes the pattern further. A single deletion mutation, C.3416 delt, accounts for essentially 100% of pathogenic alleles, causing hereditary spastic paraparesis, and its carrier frequency, 1 in 27, ranks among the highest documented anywhere in the entire catalog. USH2A rounds out the list. A splice site mutation, C. 12067-2AG, is linked to Usher syndrome type 2, a condition that combines progressive hearing loss with vision loss, compounding two senses at once. Taken together, these 5 disorders form one of the most densely documented founder mutation profiles of any Central Asian Jewish community currently recorded in clinical genetics literature. Genetic counselors treat this catalog as a first-line screening tool for exactly that reason. These founder variants account for such a disproportionate share of all disease-causing mutations found in this population that testing for them first, before anything else, makes practical clinical sense. None of this happens without a specific kind of demographic history, the kind called a founder effect. A founder effect occurs when a population descends from a small number of ancestors, which means any mutation carried by one of those ancestors can spread to strikingly high frequency, purely through generations of relative isolation, with no need for the mutation to offer any advantage at all. Set the Bukharan pattern against the wider mtDNA research on Jewish diaspora communities. Mountain Jews of the Caucasus show 58.6% of their entire maternal genetic variation tracing back to a single founding woman. Yemenite Jews show 42% of their maternal variation tracing to just 5 founding women. By contrast, the larger non-Ashkenazi communities studied in that same body of research, Moroccan, Iraqi, Iranian, and Iberian exile Jews, showed no comparable narrow founder effect at all. Bukharan Jews land somewhere in between. Not a single woman bottleneck like Mountain Jews, but tight enough regional isolation, Uzbekistan on one side, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan on the other, to produce 2 distinguishable disease mutation profiles within just a handful of centuries. That's the mechanism behind everything in the founder mutation catalog. Not some unusual biological vulnerability, just ordinary genetics responding to a specific kind of demographic history. And isolation, in genetic terms, doesn't require total isolation from the outside world. It just requires enough generations of a population marrying largely within itself, region by region, for those regional lines to stay traceable centuries later, which means the same forces that hid this community behind a home's ordinary walls also wrote its story into its genes. Step back to the framework this whole investigation opened with. Behar's 2010 study placed Jewish populations worldwide into 2 broad outcomes: communities that preserved a distinct diaspora genetic signature, and communities like the Beta Israel and the Bene Israel, whose genetic signal was absorbed into their host populations instead. Bukharan Jews land firmly in the first group. The T2C1G2 maternal lineage, found nowhere else on Earth, reinforces exactly that placement. Centuries embedded in Central Asia did not erase a traceable Middle Eastern maternal origin. It stayed intact, distinct, identifiable. The Y-DNA matches point the same direction from a different angle. Paternal lines connecting to Sephardic families in Turkey and in Spain, and even to Christian Lebanese lines, all converging on a shared ancient Levantine root that fragmented across religion and geography over roughly 2,000 years. Not a Central Asian origin at all, a Levantine one that simply traveled east. And yet the founder disease catalog complicates any tidy version of that story. The internal split between Uzbek origin and Kazakh or Tajik origin isn't a footnote. It's written directly into the disease mutation record, meaning Bukharan Jews were never genetically one population to begin with, even after everything else about them converged. Some threads never got tied off. The 1984 blood study's African-associated markers, the ones found in Bukharan Jews but absent from the neighboring Georgian Jewish sample, remain to this day without a fully settled explanation anywhere in the published literature. And the community's own oral tradition, descent from the tribes exiled by Assyria in 722 BCE, remains neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out by any of this. A gap between story and sequence that genetics alone hasn't closed, which leaves one open thread the data hasn't finished pulling on. Every genetic study cited in this investigation was built from a limited number of willing testers and clinical patients, people now dispersed across Israel, Queens, Austria, and Australia, rather than concentrated anywhere near Bukhara itself. That matters more than it might seem. As the last handful of Bukhara's Jewish residents ages, and the in-place community edges toward zero, the opportunity to sample DNA from people whose families genuinely never left the original region is closing, permanently, in real time. 2 questions remain open because there simply isn't enough data left in the ground, or in the remaining population, to close them. First, whether the Kazakhstan and Tajikistan founder mutation and the separate Uzbekistan founder mutation reflect 2 originally separate migrations that later merged into one identity, or a single migration that split apart and re-isolated only after arriving in Central Asia. Second, how the African-associated blood markers entered the Bukharan gene pool at all, when that same 1984 study found no trace of them in the neighboring Georgian Jewish sample. So when a house disguised as an ordinary home held a hidden synagogue for 2 centuries, was it only hiding a religion? Or was it, without anyone in the room ever knowing it, also hiding the answer to where its own occupants really came from? The Rubinov House Synagogue's walls kept a secret on purpose, built by people who knew exactly what they were concealing and why. The DNA kept one by accident, carried forward by people who had no way of knowing what their own blood was recording, generation after generation, long before anyone had the tools to read it.